The Poison with Zero Trace, the Holmes Files. Dear friends, we are so glad to welcome you once again, and we are absolutely delighted to have your company this evening. A heartfelt greeting tonight to our listeners in Canada, the USA, and Cyprus. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, and tell us, what is the most beautiful village or countryside you've ever visited? Settle in, get comfortable, and now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Arrival. It was a raw evening in November, the sort that drives every honest Londoner indoors and leaves the streets to the fog and the lamplighters, when a cab rattled to a halt outside 221B Baker Street and disgorged a young woman who seemed barely able to stand upright with fright. The fog that night had a particular character I have never forgotten, thick and yellow-brown, tasting faintly of coal smoke and the river, pressing itself against the window panes like something with intention. I had been dozing over the lancet by the fire, Holmes's violin lying silent across his knee where he had abandoned it an hour before, when the sound of hooves reached us from below. Holmes was on his feet before Mrs. Hudson's knock ever came at the door. "A Lady Watson, and in considerable distress," he said, cocking his head toward the stairs with that peculiar stillness he assumed when every faculty had turned, at once, to observation. Note the uneven rhythm of the horse, pulled up twice before committing to stop outside our door rather than passing on. Indecision, Watson, or fear of being seen to arrive here at all, and do you hear how the second footfall on the pavement follows a full 2 seconds behind the first? She has paused on the step. She is gathering her courage. Or catching her breath, I offered. "Watson, you grow perceptive," he said, without a trace of irony that I could detect, which was, with Holmes, always the most dangerous kind. Mrs. Hudson showed her in a moment later, Miss Eleanor Carlyle, no more than 25, dressed in mourning that had plainly been assembled in haste. I noted, as Holmes surely had before me, that the black gloves did not match the coat, that a hem had been let down crudely with stitches, visible even by lamplight, and that her boots, though good leather, were mismatched in polish, as though she had dressed by candlelight without a maid's assistance, and had not troubled to check the result in a glass. She sat where Holmes indicated, in the basket chair nearest the fire, and began at once to twist a small linen handkerchief in her lap, with a nervous, repetitive motion that told me more of her state of mind than any words could have done. "Mr. Holmes," she began, and her voice, though low, carried a controlled desperation that I had heard before in this room, and had learned never to underestimate. "They are saying my uncle died by misadventure. I do not believe it. I do not believe it for one moment, and no one else will listen to me. Not the coroner, not the family solicitor, not even my own cousin, who has more reason than anyone to want the matter closed quietly and quickly." "Then you have come to the right sitting room," said Holmes, settling into his own chair opposite and steepling his long fingers before him, his eyes never leaving her face. "Pray begin at the beginning, Miss Carlyle, and omit nothing on the grounds that it seems trivial, foolish, or unconnected to the matter at hand. It is very often the trivial detail that hangs a guilty man or saves an innocent one. I have built an entire career, such as it is, upon precisely that principle." She drew a long breath, the sort one takes before plunging into cold water. "My uncle was Sir Edmund Carlyle, of Ravenscroft Hall in Surrey, a man of considerable means, made largely in speculation some 20 years ago, though he has lived the settled life of a country gentleman for as long as I have known him. 3 nights ago, he was found dead in his study, the door locked from the inside, the windows latched against the autumn damp. The local surgeon, a Dr. Prentice, found no wound upon the body, no sign of poison in the ordinary tests he knows to apply, nothing at all but a man who appeared simply to have stopped living where he sat, in his own chair, before his own fire. The coroner is inclined to call it heart failure, brought on by his age and his habits, and to close the inquest within the week." "And you are not so inclined," Holmes said. It was not a question. "My uncle was 61 years of age, Mr. Holmes, but he rode to hounds every week of the season without complaint, and he had passed his physician's own examination not a fortnight before his death, with Dr. Fenwick himself pronouncing his heart as sound as a man's half his age. Her voice caught, and for a moment I thought she would abandon her composure entirely, but she mastered herself with visible effort and pressed on. "And there is a broken pocket watch, Mr. Holmes. His own watch, gold, engraved with his father's initials, found upon the hearthrug some several feet distant from the chair where he sat. The glass shattered across the face, and the hands stopped at 17 minutes past 10 precisely. He was not discovered until 11:30, when Mrs. Whitmore, our housekeeper, came to bank the fire for the night and found him. Nobody in that house can explain how his watch came to lie upon the hearthrug, nor why it should mark a time more than an hour before he was found, if indeed he sat quietly reading or dozing the entire while, as everyone insists he must have done." Holmes had gone very still in the particular way I had learned, over the course of our long acquaintance, to recognize as the awakening of his interest, the look of a hound that has caught, faint but altogether unmistakable upon the evening air, the first thread of a scent it means to follow to its source, whatever the distance or the difficulty. A locked room, a dead man of robust and recently certified health, and a broken watch some distance from the body, stopped at a time that does not tally with the hour of his discovery, he murmured, half to himself, half to the fire. "Miss Carlyle, I begin to suspect that your coroner, however well-meaning, has been altogether too hasty in his conclusions, and that Dr. Prentice's tests, however thorough by the standards of a country practice, have simply failed to look for what was truly there. Tell me, is there anything else? Any small oddity, any trifle that struck you as wrong, however you may have talked yourself out of its significance since?" Miss Carlyle hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw Holmes lean very slightly forward, as a man leans toward a fire that has begun, at last, to properly catch. "There was a smear of mud upon the inner sill of one window," she said slowly, "reddish, and quite fresh, though our own garden soil is chalk-white and nothing like it. And a peculiar smell in the room when I myself looked in the following morning, beneath the coal smoke and the brandy, something faintly bitter, almost medicinal, that was gone entirely by the afternoon, and that no one else seems to have remarked upon at all." "Bitter and medicinal," Holmes repeated softly, and I saw something pass across his face that I can only describe, in retrospect, as the first faint outline of a theory beginning to assemble itself, piece by piece, in that extraordinary mind. "Watson, be so good as to fetch the Bradshaws from the shelf behind you. I believe there is a train to Surrey within the hour, and I confess I have no wish whatsoever to let this trail grow any colder than 3 days, and a hasty coroner have already made it."
Before we continue, if you're enjoying the mystery, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a clue. Now, let's get back to the case.
Chapter 2. The Client's Tale. "Tell me of the household," Holmes said, as our cab clattered toward Waterloo through streets slick with the evening's first sleet, the gas lamps swimming past in smeared halos of yellow light. "Who stood to gain by your uncle's death, who stood to lose by his continued life, and who among them bore him any grudge, however small it may have seemed at the time, for grudges, Miss Carlyle, have a way of compounding interest far more reliably than any bank." Miss Carlyle folded her hands with the particular composure of one determined not to weep twice in a single evening. "There is my cousin Julian, my uncle's heir, since Sir Edmund never married nor had children of his own, and Julian is the son of his late brother. Julian has debts, Mr. Holmes, serious ones, and not of the sort a young man confesses to his family without shame. Cards, mostly, and worse besides, if the rumors that reach even my ears are to be trusted. My uncle had twice paid them quietly, to spare the family name, and at their last meeting, I was in the next room and could not help but overhear something of it, he swore to Julian that he would not do so a third time, whatever the consequence to either of them. A motive as old as Cain, Holmes observed, watching the fog-bound streets slide past the cab window. "Who else lived beneath your uncle's roof, or had cause to visit it regularly?" "There is the housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore. She has been with the household 11 years now, and is, by every outward appearance, entirely devoted to my uncle's memory. She wept more openly at his death than I did myself, Mr. Holmes, and I am ashamed to admit it. But there are things about her past that no one in the household speaks of, out of what I have always taken for tact, though I confess I have begun to wonder whether it is something closer to unease. She came to us as a widow from the north, from Leeds, I believe, and her first husband, I am told, was an apothecary who died under circumstances that were never fully explained to any of us. A fever, we always understood, though I could not say who first told me so, nor whether it was ever more than a comfortable assumption that took root and was never questioned. Holmes's gaze had sharpened perceptibly. An apothecary, and one whose death was never fully explained. That is a detail worth a very great deal more than its apparent weight, Miss Carlyle. I beg you to continue. There is also Dr. Alaric Fenwick, our family physician these 15 years, who examined my uncle not a fortnight before his death, and pronounced him entirely sound, as I have already told you. He called at the hall that very evening, in fact, having some business to discuss regarding my uncle's gout, which had troubled him on and off for some years. She hesitated, and I saw a flush of something like guilt colour her pale cheeks. I mention him only for the sake of completeness, Mr. Holmes. He has been a true friend to this family for longer than I have been alive, nearly, and it seems monstrous even to speak his name in the same breath as suspicion. It is precisely the friend of 15 years' standing whom one ought never to omit from such an inquiry, said Holmes mildly, though I caught the particular gleam in his eye that told me the observation had struck him as significant, whatever his tone. Now, the room itself, Miss Carlyle. I want you to close your eyes, if it will help you, and describe it to me as though you stood within it at this very moment. She did close her eyes, and her voice, when it came again, was steadier for the discipline of the exercise. A study on the ground floor of the house, facing the rose garden to the south. One door only, of heavy oak, which was found bolted upon the inside when Mrs. Whitmore tried it and could not gain entry, and had to send for the boot boy to climb round by the window, though he found that latch too, and it was Dr. Fenwick himself, summoned in haste, who at last forced the door from its hinges. My uncle was found seated in his armchair before the fire, quite peacefully, as though he had simply fallen asleep and never woken. There was a glass of his usual evening brandy upon the small table at his elbow, nearly full. He had taken no more than a mouthful or two by the level of it. The surgeon tested the brandy that very night for the common poisons, arsenic, strychnine, prussic acid, and one or two others whose names I did not catch, and found nothing whatsoever to explain his death. And no odour in the room, beyond the brandy and the coal smoke you have already mentioned. None that Dr. Prentice remarked upon at the time. It was only I myself, the following morning, who noticed the faint bitterness I described to you, and by then Dr. Prentice had already given his opinion, and the room had been aired twice over. A pity, though not, I think, a fatal one, Holmes murmured. And the mud upon the sill, was it examined? The local constable glanced at it, and pronounced it the gardener's boot print, tracked in some earlier day, when the window had been opened to air the room, and no one troubled to look further. I confess I did not think to argue the point at the time. It was only in the days since, turning the whole matter over and over in my mind until I could scarcely sleep, that it began to seem to me altogether too convenient an explanation, offered too quickly by men too eager to close the matter and be done with it. Gardeners, said Holmes, with the faintest edge of dry humour, do not customarily climb through latched windows to tend flower beds, Miss Carlyle, whatever the season. We shall see the room for ourselves within the hour, and form our own conclusions, unclouded by anyone else's eagerness to be finished. He fell silent then for some minutes, watching the wet streets slide past, and I saw him turn the case over and over in his mind, as a jeweller turns a stone, seeking the one angle at which its true nature might be revealed. At length he spoke again, half to himself. There is one further thing I would ask you, Miss Carlyle, though I hesitate to raise it, for it touches upon matters a young lady is not generally encouraged to notice. In the days before your uncle's death, did anything in his manner strike you as changed? Was he troubled, elated, unusually forgetful, unusually precise? Anything at all outside his ordinary habit? She considered this with evident care, as though turning back through the pages of a diary in her mind. Now that you ask it directly, Mr. Holmes, there was one thing. He had taken to locking his desk drawer of an evening, which he had never troubled to do before in all the years I have lived beneath his roof. And he asked me, not 4 days before he died, whether I had ever heard tell of an apothecary's family from Leeds by the name of Whitmore, meaning, I now realize with some discomfort, some connection of Mrs. Whitmore's own, though I did not think to ask him why he wished to know, nor did I ever learn what prompted the question. Holmes went very still, and I saw the faint, private satisfaction of a man who has just heard a stray piece of a puzzle click, unlooked for, into place. That, Miss Carlyle, is worth a very great deal more to me than you can presently know. I am obliged to you for it, sincerely. Chapter 3. The Crime Scene. Ravenscroft Hall rose out of the fog like something imagined rather than built, its dark gables dripping steadily with the day's accumulated rain, its windows, all but one, lit low behind drawn curtains, watching our approach like so many half-closed eyes. Inspector Lestrade was already upon the doorstep when our cab drew up at last, his bowler hat beaded with moisture, his expression caught between irritation and the particular grudging relief he always seemed to feel, despite every protestation to the contrary, at Holmes's arrival upon a case that had begun to trouble him more than he cared to admit. I might have known Miss Carlyle would bring you into it, Mr. Holmes, whatever the family solicitor advised her, he said, falling into step beside us as we mounted the wide stone stairs. I'll tell you plainly, there's nothing here but a sad, ordinary death and a family too proud, or too fanciful, to accept a natural end when one is staring them in the face. Then you will have no objection whatsoever to my confirming your excellent conclusions for you, Inspector, and saving you the trouble of defending them further, Holmes said, already moving past him into the darkened hall, his eyes traveling over every surface with the swift, cataloguing precision I had watched 1,000 times before and never once ceased to marvel at. The study, when we reached it, was precisely as Miss Carlyle had described, dark-panelled in old oak, gone nearly black with age and coal smoke, heavy with the smell of cold ash and stale tobacco that no amount of airing had entirely dispelled. Holmes crossed directly to the near window and examined the smear of reddish clay upon the sill with his lens, turning his head this way and that to catch the last of the failing daylight, then knelt upon the carpet beneath it and studied the pile, inch by inch, with an intensity that made even Lestrade, hardened as he was to such performances, fall silent and watch. Lestrade, has anyone thought to match this clay against the soil of the grounds themselves? The gardeners, like as not, tracked in on his boots some day or other. The gardener's boots, Inspector, are, I observe them drying even now by the kitchen door as we passed, caked thickly with the grey-white chalk soil of this particular garden, which I noted for myself upon our approach along the drive. This clay upon the sill is red, ferrous in character, and, unless I am very much mistaken, of a type found some distance from this house entirely, along the lower towpath by the river, where the ground has been drained for market gardens these 40 years and more, and where no chalk of this county's usual character is to be found at all. Holmes rose, brushing the knees of his trousers, and regarded the inspector with an expression of patient forbearance. Someone came through this window, Inspector, who had walked the river towpath that very evening, or very shortly before it. That is emphatically not your gardener, whose boots I have just described to you in some detail. He moved next to the hearth, where a rough chalk outline still marked the spot upon the rug where the broken watch had lain before the constable removed it for safekeeping, and crouched beside it, a long while, saying nothing at all, his eyes narrowed in concentration. I saw him produce his lens once more and examine, of all things, the coal scuttle standing beside the grate. Watson, the fire had burned very low by the time the body was found, had it not? according to Mrs. Whitmore's own account. Nearly out, I believe Miss Carlyle told us. And yet it was made up quite generously at some point during the evening. Observe how the coal here is banked thickly at the back, unburned, as though built up with some deliberation, and then abandoned before it ever properly took hold. He turned to address Lestrade directly. Was this fire tended by anyone after the body was discovered, to your knowledge? Not that any of the servants have admitted to me. Then someone built up this fire with their own hands and left the room again before it had truly caught, which argues either that they left in some haste or that they were interrupted in the act by some sound or movement they had not anticipated. Holmes rose fully and crossed at last to the dead man's own chair, where he studied the brandy glass, still standing upon its small table precisely where it had been found, with a peculiar and focused intensity. He sniffed carefully at the rim, then touched the barest fraction of a fingertip to the dried residue at the bottom of the glass, and tasted it, the smallest possible quantity, and only, as I well knew from long observation, after a private and rapid calculation of risk, I had come to trust absolutely, though it never failed to alarm me in the moment. There is a bitterness here, Watson, beneath the brandy, very faint indeed, but quite unmistakable to a trained palate, and of a character I do not immediately recognize from any poison in common use, he said quietly. Watson, I shall want a sample of this residue sent to Barlow at the Home Office laboratory this very night, by the fastest possible means, and tested for every alkaloid he can name from memory, and several besides that he may need to consult his library to identify. Tell him it is a matter of some urgency, and that I shall owe him a further debt beyond the many he already holds against me. Lestrade gave a short, disbelieving snort. And what will that prove, Mr. Holmes, that Dr. Prentice's own tests did not already establish to everyone's satisfaction but your own? Holmes's grey eyes glittered in the lamplight with something that might, in a less controlled man, have been called excitement. That, my dear Inspector, is precisely what I intend to discover before this house sees another sunrise, and I would advise you, most sincerely, not to close your inquest until I have done so. He turned back to the room once more and stood a while longer in its centre, entirely motionless, his eyes travelling slowly from the hearth to the window to the desk and back again, as though committing every particular of the chamber to some permanent gallery within his own memory. There is a quality to this room, Watson, that I find I cannot yet name, though I feel it pressing upon me none the less. It is too orderly. A man does not die in violence, however subtle, without some small disturbance of his surroundings, a cushion displaced, a rug rucked, a book fallen from a table. Here everything stands precisely as it would upon an ordinary evening of quiet reading, save for that one broken watch lying where no watch has any natural business to lie. Whoever did this thing, Watson, took very great care to disturb as little as possible, which argues either a murderer of extraordinary coolness or one who did not consider himself, in his own private reckoning, to be committing murder at all, but something closer, in his own mind, to the administering of a long overdue and entirely deserved justice. Lestrade grumbled some further half-hearted objection, but he did not, I noticed, actually forbid the sending of the sample, and left us shortly afterward to make his own more conventional inquiries among the household staff, of the sort that ask only who saw whom and at what hour, and rarely trouble themselves with why a fire was built up and left to smoulder, or why a broken watch should lie a full 6 feet from the chair in which its owner died. Holmes remained a further quarter-hour alone in the study after the inspector's departure, and I, knowing better than to press him with conversation at such a time, occupied myself examining the bookshelves that lined the far wall, chiefly volumes of estate management and sporting almanacs, though I noted, tucked between 2 ledgers, a slim volume on tropical botany that seemed, upon reflection, a curious choice for a country gentleman's shelf, and which I mentioned to Holmes only in passing, not then grasping its significance. "You have a keener eye than you credit yourself with, Watson," was all he said at the time, though he took the volume down and turned its pages with evident interest before returning it, with great precision, to precisely the place from which it had come.
Before we continue, if you're enjoying the mystery, Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a clue. Now, let's get back to the case.
Chapter 4. Initial Deductions. We found Mrs. Whitmore in the servants' hall below stairs, seated very upright at the long deal table with a mending basket before her, that she was not, in truth, attending to at all, a spare, upright woman of perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair scraped severely back beneath her cap, and eyes of a pale, watchful blue that gave away nothing whatsoever of what passed behind them. She answered Holmes's questions with the flat, careful correctness of a woman long practiced, whether by temperament or by necessity, in giving away no more than was strictly asked of her. "Sir Edmund rang for nothing after 9 that evening," she said, her hands folding themselves neatly in her lap. "I looked in upon the study myself at 10:30, as was my habit, to bank the fire for the night before retiring, and found the room already quite warm, warmer, in fact, than I should have expected at that hour. I assumed at the time that he had done it himself, though it was not, I will say, at all his usual custom to trouble with such things when a servant was at hand to do it for him. Not his habit," Holmes repeated softly, as though tasting the phrase. "And yet the fire was built up that night, and then abandoned before it ever properly caught. Curious, Mrs. Whitmore, do you not think? Did you see or hear anyone at all about the grounds that evening, before or after your own visit to the room?" "Only Dr. Fenwick's trap, leaving by the side gate a little after 10 o'clock. I remarked upon it at the time, in my own thoughts, because he generally makes use of the front drive when he calls, as befits a gentleman of his standing, and I wondered idly why he should choose the side gate on that particular evening, though I confess I thought no more of it until this moment." Holmes did not react outwardly to this, though I, who had studied his face across 100 such interviews, saw the flicker of sharp interest cross it and vanish again beneath his habitual composure, so swiftly that I doubt Mrs. Whitmore herself remarked it at all. "You have been housekeeper in this house 11 years, I understand from Miss Carlyle. Before that, I am told you were married." For the first time in our brief acquaintance, something moved behind the woman's carefully composed features. Not, I thought, the guilt of a woman caught in a lie, but something closer to old grief, guarded fiercely, and for a very long time, against precisely this sort of casual disturbance. "My husband was an apothecary in Leeds, Mr. Holmes. He died of a fever some years before I ever came south to this house. I do not see what that has to do with Sir Edmund's death, nor why you should trouble to ask after it at all." "Perhaps nothing whatsoever," said Holmes gently, in a tone I recognized as entirely deceptive, and let the matter drop for the present, though I knew him far too well to imagine it had, in fact, dropped from his mind in the slightest degree. He thanked her for her time, with a courtesy that seemed, for a moment, to catch her off guard, and as we rose to leave the servants' hall, I saw her eyes follow him to the door with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite relief, but some uneasy mixture of the two, as though she could not yet decide whether this quiet, watchful stranger had come to her house as a friend or as an enemy, and dared not ask outright which he meant to prove himself to be. "She is a woman guarding something, Watson," Holmes said, once we were beyond the kitchen door and out into the cold evening air. "That much I would stake my reputation upon. Whether it is guilt or merely old grief, I cannot yet say with certainty, and I have learned, over long years of this work, never to mistake the one for the other, merely because they so often wear the same quiet, careful face." Outside, in the rose garden, its beds now bare and blackened with the first frosts of the season, he stood a long while in silence beneath the darkening sky, turning something over, not visibly in his hands, but plainly and unmistakably in his thoughts, his brow furrowed in the particular manner that told me not to interrupt him for any consideration short of genuine emergency. "Watson, we have 3 curious facts now before us, and as yet no single theory that unites them satisfactorily. A window entered, we may reasonably suppose, by someone who had walked the river towpath that very evening. A fire built up with evident purpose, and then abandoned, unfinished, in apparent haste. And a physician of 15 years' standing who left this house by the side gate at an unaccustomed hour by a route he does not generally take. What manner of connection, I ask myself, could possibly bind together a riverside tramp, an unfinished fire, and a trusted family doctor's departure by an unfamiliar gate? I confess I cannot begin to see it, I said honestly. Nor, as yet, can I, which is precisely why we shall go directly and ask Dr. Fenwick himself what business took him to that side gate at 10 o'clock upon the very evening his oldest friend and patient died, and why, if he is indeed as entirely blameless as Miss Carlyle so evidently believes him to be, his account of that hour should prove so troublesome to have confirmed by any independent witness. We walked out to the side gate itself, before returning to the house, and Holmes paused there a long while, examining the gate-post and the soft ground beneath it with his lens, though the recent rain had done much to erase whatever traces might once have told a clearer tale of the trap's passing. The ruts here are consistent with a light physician's trap, Watson, and they turn away from the house, toward the river road, rather than toward the village, and Dr. Fenwick's own surgery, which I confess I find suggestive, though I would not yet call it conclusive upon its own. A man bound directly home does not generally choose the longer and muddier road along the river, unless he has some particular reason to avoid the shorter one, or some errand of his own to attend to before he returns at last to his own hearth and his own bed. What errand could a physician possibly have upon a lonely river road at such an hour? That, Watson, is precisely the sort of question I have found it most profitable in 20 years of this curious profession, never to answer by guesswork, when a little patience will furnish the true answer instead, and furnish it far more reliably. Chapter 5. The First Suspect. Before we called upon Dr. Fenwick, however, Holmes insisted upon seeking out Julian Carlyle, whom we found at last in the billiard room at the rear of the house, a handsome, dissipated young man of perhaps 28, with the particular grey pallor of one who has not slept properly in some days, whether from grief, from guilt, or from something less creditable than either I could not yet begin to say with confidence. "I suppose you've come to hang the debts round my neck like everyone else has, Mr. Holmes," he said, not troubling himself to rise from where he lounged against the billiard table, a cue held loosely in one hand, though no game appeared to be in progress. "The solicitor's already made it plain enough what he thinks of my prospects, and Eleanor looks at me as though I'd done it myself, whatever she says to my face. I have come to hear your own account of the evening your uncle died, Mr. Carlyle, and nothing more than that at present," said Holmes evenly, seating himself uninvited upon a low leather chair near the fire, and regarding the young man with an expression of perfect, patient neutrality. "Where were you, precisely, between the hours of 9 and 11:30 that evening?" "In my rooms in town. I did not come down to the hall at all that week, had no cause to, and no wish to, given how our last conversation had gone." He said it a fraction too quickly for my liking, and I saw Holmes's stillness sharpen in a way that told me he had noted the same thing. "You will not object, then, to my confirming that account with your club, or with whichever companions can vouch for your presence in town throughout that particular evening?" Julian's jaw tightened visibly. "Confirm what you like, Mr. Holmes. I've nothing to hide from you or anyone." Holmes rose without haste and crossed unhurriedly to the corner of the room, where a pair of muddied boots stood drying beside the door, evidently set there by a servant to be cleaned and not yet attended to. He ran a finger lightly along the billiard table's edge as he passed, though I could not imagine what, if anything, it told him. "Your boots, Mr. Carlyle, by the door there. I could not help but notice them upon our way in, and I notice now that I could not help but notice them a second time. Fine calfskin, of good quality, and yet the left boot carries, at the instep, a trace of red clay, very similar in character to that which I discovered not an hour ago upon the sill of your late uncle's study window." The young man went white as chalk, then flushed an ugly, mottled red that spread from his collar to his hairline. I walked along by the river that week, on more than one occasion. It proves nothing whatsoever, and you know it proves nothing. It proves, at the very least, that you were not, in point of fact, in town for the entirety of that week, as you have just now sworn to me, which is a beginning, however small," said Holmes, without any particular heat in his voice, though his eyes never left the young man's face. "I do not accuse you of murder yet, Mr. Carlyle, and I would ask you to note that distinction with some care, for it may yet matter a great deal to you. But I would advise you, in the strongest possible terms, to tell me the whole truth now, in full and without further omission, before I am obliged to uncover it for myself piece by piece, as I generally do, sooner or later, and generally to the considerable disadvantage of whoever has attempted to conceal it from me." There followed a long silence, broken only by the settling of coals in the grate. Then, in a lower and altogether more subdued voice, Julian said, "I came down that night, yes. I meant to ask him, to beg him, if I am honest, which I have not been with anyone these past 3 days, one final time, about the debts, which have grown considerably worse than even my uncle knew. I came through the garden rather than the front drive, because I did not wish the servants to see me arrive and carry tales of it back to my uncle before I had even the chance to speak with him myself. I looked in through the study window and saw him alive and well, seated at his desk with his crossword before him, near 10 o'clock by my own watch. I lost my nerve entirely. I am not proud of it, Mr. Holmes, but there it is, and went away again, without ever once entering the house or speaking a word to him. That is the whole and complete truth of the matter, and I am perfectly aware that it sounds precisely like the sort of lie a guilty man would construct for himself, which is exactly why I did not offer it to the police in the first instance." Holmes regarded him for a long moment with an expression I found difficult to read even after so many years of study. "It has, at the very least, the singular virtue of satisfactorily explaining the clay upon the windowsill without in any way explaining your uncle's death," he said at last. "Whether it is the truth in its entirety remains very much to be seen, and I shall want it confirmed by whatever means present themselves. But if you did indeed see your uncle alive and in apparent good health at 10 o'clock, Mr. Carlyle, you have just given me something rather more valuable to my purposes than any alibi you might have offered. You have given me a considerably narrower window of time in which the murderer, if murderer there be, in this business at all, must have done his work." Chapter 6. A Hidden Clue. That evening, while the diminished household dined in a subdued and watchful silence that I could feel pressing upon the dining room like a physical weight, Holmes and I excused ourselves early and returned alone to the study, now formally released by Lestrade, who had pronounced himself entirely satisfied with the day's inquiries and returned to town on the evening train, leaving instruction that the room be locked and left undisturbed until the inquest reconvened. "Satisfied," Holmes said scornfully, striking a match to the desk lamp and watching the small flame catch and steady. "Watson, hand me that blotting pad from the corner of the desk, if you would be so good." Sir Edmund's desk was in perfect order in every respect but one. A half-finished crossword puzzle, neatly clipped from that week's Times, lay beneath a small brass paperweight shaped like a fox's head, several of its answers filled in with a firm, confident, unhurried hand that spoke of a man entirely at his ease. The final 3 squares, however, remained blank, the pencil that must have completed the rest lying discarded beside it at an angle that suggested it had simply been set down, not deliberately laid aside. A man does not generally abandon a crossword in the very middle of a clue, Watson, unless he is interrupted by something he judges more pressing, Holmes murmured, studying the paper closely by the lamp's yellow light. He read the unsolved clue aloud, his voice low and thoughtful. "Deceiver's final resting place, 7 letters. "What answer suggests itself to you, Watson, upon a moment's reflection?" I confessed, not for the first time in our long association, that I had no idea whatsoever, nor, I rather suspect, did Sir Edmund himself, not before he was interrupted, at any rate. Holmes turned the paper over with careful fingers and gave a soft exclamation of interest. Upon the reverse, in pencil, in a hand quite unlike Sir Edmund's own careful copperplate that filled the answers on the other side, was scrawled a single hurried line, "The Old Holt, Marsden Lane, Midnight Thurs. A message, Watson, passed to someone in this very room, or left for them to find, and not, I think we may safely say, by our host himself. He produced from an inner pocket of his coat a small item wrapped carefully in tissue paper, which Lestrade's men had catalogued in their haste, along with a dozen other trifles and evidently overlooked entirely in their eagerness to close the matter. A single railway ticket, third class, made out to a disused halt some 3 miles distant from the hall, dated the very day of Sir Edmund's death. Marsden Lane, the very place named in this note upon the crossword, I said, following his reasoning as best I could. Precisely so. And observe, Watson, he held the ticket up close to the lamp, turning it this way and that beneath his lens. This ticket was purchased not by Sir Edmund himself, whose movements upon that particular day are well accounted for by the household staff and admit of no gap sufficient for such a journey, nor, I think, by young Julian, who has told us plainly where his own afternoon was spent, and can, I do not doubt, prove it beyond serious challenge if pressed to do so. Someone else entirely wished for us, for whoever should eventually investigate this death, to find this ticket and this cryptic note together, and to draw from them an obvious, tidy, and altogether convenient conclusion, that Sir Edmund was engaged in some secret assignation, some matter of blackmail perhaps, that led at last to his death at a stranger's hand, far from this house and this family entirely. You believe it planted, then, deliberately, to mislead whoever should come looking. I believe it altogether too convenient in every particular, Watson. And convenience, in my long experience of such matters, is very nearly the one thing a genuine and unstaged crime scene almost never troubles itself to offer us. Holmes turned the ticket over once more in his long fingers and stiffened abruptly, his whole attention narrowing upon a single point, caught fast in the perforated edge where the ticket had been torn from its book, nearly invisible against the buff-coloured card unless one held it precisely to the light as he now did, was a single hair, long, coarse, and grey. Not Sir Edmund's own hair, you will recall from our examination of the body this afternoon, he said quietly, holding it up for my inspection. His hair, though greying at the temples, was still predominantly dark, as befits a man of his years who has led an active outdoor life. Nor, I think, is it Mrs. Whitmore's, whose hair, as we observed for ourselves not an hour ago, is fine in texture and uniformly iron grey throughout its length, whereas this specimen is considerably coarser and, observe closely, Watson, if your eyes will permit it, paler and finer at the root than at the tip, which suggests very strongly a man whose hair has begun to grey only these past few years, and unevenly at that, as so often happens with gentlemen of a certain age who have led lives of considerable mental strain. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the corridor beyond the study door, sharp and unmistakable in the silence of the sleeping house. Holmes was across the room and had the door open in a single fluid motion before I had fully registered the sound myself, but the passage beyond stood entirely empty, lit only by the guttering flame of a single wall sconce, save for the faintest trace of scent upon the still air, gone almost before I could properly name it. The sharp, clean smell of carbolic soap, and beneath it, fainter still, something else, the unmistakable, faintly acrid bitterness of laboratory chemicals, the sort no ordinary household in Surrey would ever have occasion to keep. Someone, Holmes said softly, closing the door again with great care and turning back to face me across the lamplit room, his expression graver than I had seen it in some time, has been standing at that door, listening to every word we have spoken this past quarter hour. And I begin, Watson, to have a very shrewd and altogether uncomfortable notion of precisely who that someone must have been. We did not sleep that night, or not for many hours of it. Holmes sat long before the dying study fire, turning the grey hair and the railway ticket over and over between his fingers, saying little, while I kept watch at the window against the unlikely but not impossible chance that our unseen listener might attempt some further mischief before dawn. Somewhere in the small hours a dog-fox screamed once, far off across the frosted park, and Holmes looked up sharply at the sound before subsiding again into his own thoughts. "Watson," he said at last, as the first grey light of morning began to touch the curtains. "I have been a fool these 12 hours past, though I trust a forgivable one. I have been asking myself who possessed the knowledge to select this poison, and who possessed the opportunity to administer it, and I have neglected, until this very moment, to ask the one question that ought to have come first of all. Who, in this entire household and its circle, possessed any reason whatsoever to wish Sir Edmund Carlyle dead, that was not merely a matter of debt or inheritance, but of an old and unhealed wound, reaching back further than any of us have yet troubled to look? A man does not devise so exquisite and so patient a method of murder over some fortnight's quarrel. Such careful, bloodless vengeance is the fruit of years, Watson, not of weeks. And I find myself now exceedingly curious to learn precisely how many years Dr. Fenwick has attended this household, and what, if anything, preceded his arrival in it." Chapter 7. The Twist Barlow's telegram reached us at the hall the following morning, delivered by a breathless boy on a bicycle, who had ridden the better part of 6 miles from the nearest telegraph office, and Holmes read it through twice in complete silence, before passing it across the breakfast table to me, without a single word of comment, his face unusually pale in the grey morning light filtering through the dining-room curtains. The brandy residue, tested exhaustively through the whole of the previous night by a man Holmes assured me had no equal in England for such work, had yielded at last, after every common test had failed exactly as Dr. Prentice's own tests had failed before them, unmistakable and undeniable traces of a rare alkaloid derived from a particular Southeast Asian shrub employed by certain native practitioners, in vanishingly small and carefully measured doses, as a treatment for irregularities of the heartbeat, and, in only slightly larger doses, administered by a hand that knew precisely what it was about, as a poison of extraordinary subtlety that mimicked in every outward particular the symptoms of ordinary heart failure in an elderly man, leaving behind no telltale odor that an untrained nose would detect, no discoloration, and defeating utterly every chemical test then known to English forensic medicine, however thoroughly and conscientiously applied. A poison, Watson, that only a man with access to a well-stocked pharmacological library, considerable specialist training, and rare imported botanical specimens could ever hope to obtain in the first place, still less know how to employ with such exact and calculated murderous precision as was employed here. "Dr. Fenwick," I said, the name settling upon me with an unpleasant weight, for I had liked the man well enough upon our brief introduction the previous evening, and had found it difficult, even then, to credit the notion. "Dr. Fenwick," Holmes agreed grimly, setting down his coffee cup untouched. "Recall Mrs. Whitmore's own testimony, freely given and unprompted, his trap left by the side gate near 10 o'clock that evening, not by the front drive, as was invariably his custom upon every previous visit, the unmistakable mark of a man wishing very much to avoid being seen departing at all, let alone departing at that particular hour when his patient still lived and required, so far as anyone in that house then knew, no further attendance that night. Recall, too, the grey hair we discovered last evening, coarse in texture and unevenly greyed from root to tip. I took the small liberty, over dinner last night, of examining Dr. Fenwick's own head rather more closely than good manners generally permit, under the pretext of admiring the workmanship of his watch chain, and I can tell you now with complete confidence that it matches our specimen in every particular I was able to observe. And recall, above all else, Watson, that it was Dr. Fenwick himself who examined Sir Edmund not a fortnight before his death, and pronounced him perfectly sound in every respect, a diagnosis a man might deliver with very great and very genuine confidence indeed, if he already knew, with equal and rather more sinister confidence, precisely how, and precisely when, that soundness of health was shortly to fail him entirely. But the crossword note, the railway ticket, the whole elaborate business of Marsden Lane, you said yourself only last night that you believed them planted, a false trail laid deliberately to mislead us. Planted by Fenwick's own hand, I now believe with very little remaining doubt, and planted, moreover, rather clumsily, once he had realized, correctly as it happens, until our own involvement disturbed his calculations that the local police were exceedingly unlikely to look past a comfortable verdict of natural causes, and that no such elaborate misdirection had ever truly been necessary at all. He is a man of very considerable intellect in matters of physic and pharmacology, Watson. That much I do not for one moment dispute. But he is no criminal by nature or by training, and criminals of true and patient genius do not, as a general rule, leave a single grey hair of their own caught fast in a railway ticket's perforated edge for a passing detective to discover the following evening. It was fear that drove him to manufacture that false trail after the fact of the murder itself, Watson, not cunning, fear that something yet remaining in that locked room might one day incriminate him, however unlikely such an outcome had seemed to him at the time he first administered the poison. What possible motive could he have had? He stood to inherit nothing whatsoever from Sir Edmund's death, so far as anyone here has suggested to us. That, said Holmes, rising from the table and reaching for his coat with sudden decision, is the one remaining thread I have not yet drawn fully taut, and I do not propose to leave it hanging loose a moment longer than necessity requires. A physician of 15 years' standing, Watson, does not calmly murder his patient and his oldest friend without very considerable and very particular cause, and I do not for one instant believe that greed alone can account for it. Fenwick is by every account comfortably situated in his own right, and stood, so far as we have been able to establish, to inherit nothing whatsoever under Sir Edmund's will. No, Watson, there is a second motive concealed beneath the first, older and considerably darker, and I strongly suspect, though I do not yet know it for certain, that it concerns Mrs. Whitmore's late husband, the Leeds apothecary, whose death was never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction, and a debt of an altogether different and more terrible character than any mere matter of money. We shall lay a trap tonight, Watson, that will draw the whole truth out of him at last, whether he wishes freely to give it to us or not. Before we returned to the hall, Holmes made one further call upon the elderly parish clerk who kept the local register, and spent the better part of an hour bent over ledgers of births, marriages, and deaths, reaching back some 30 years, tracing with his finger the small, faded entries of a Leeds family transplanted, at some point, to this quiet Surrey parish. He said little of what he found there, save that it confirmed a supposition he had already formed. But I noticed that when at last we left the clerk's cramped little office, his face wore the particular grave expression I had come to associate not with triumph, but with the weary certainty of a man who has found precisely what he expected, and taken no pleasure whatsoever in the finding of it. Chapter 8. The trap is set at Holmes's careful and precise direction. Miss Carlyle issued invitations that very afternoon for a small dinner to be held that same evening, ostensibly, and quite plausibly, to thank the immediate household and closest family connections for their support and forbearance throughout so difficult a week. But in truth, as only Holmes and I, and, by necessity, Miss Carlyle herself understood, to gather every person of genuine interest to the case beneath a single roof at a single hour, entirely under Holmes's own quiet direction. Dr. Fenwick arrived punctually at 7, composed and solicitous as ever I had seen him, greeting Miss Carlyle with every appearance of warm and genuine sympathy, and if he felt any private unease whatsoever at Holmes's continued and evidently unexplained presence in the house a full day after the local inspector had declared himself satisfied and departed, he concealed it with an admirable and thoroughly practiced composure that spoke well of long years spent delivering difficult news to anxious families at bedsides throughout the county. It was over the second course, as the servants withdrew at Holmes's earlier private instruction and left the small party entirely alone, that Holmes, without any preamble whatsoever, set upon the white tablecloth before him, in full view of every person present, the crossword puzzle, the railway ticket, and, upon a small folded square of tissue paper, the single grey hair we had discovered together the previous evening. "Dr. Fenwick," he said pleasantly, in precisely the tone one might use to remark upon the quality of the claret, "I wonder whether you would be so very good as to explain to this company how your own hair came to be found caught fast in the perforated edge of a third-class railway ticket to Marsden Lane Halt, a ticket, I might add for the general interest, purchased on the very afternoon Sir Edmund died, and never in fact used for its stated purpose, since no train has in point of fact stopped at that particular halt at all this fortnight, owing to engineering works upon the line, a fact I took the trouble to confirm for myself with the railway company's own office in London not 3 hours ago, by telegraph. The colour drained entirely and at once from the physician's face, leaving it the grey-white of old ash. Mrs. Whitmore, seated at the far end of the table, had gone very still indeed, her fork motionless above her plate, her pale eyes fixed upon Fenwick, with an expression I found impossible, in that moment, to read with any confidence. "I do not know in the least what you mean by any of this, Mr. Holmes," Fenwick said, but the easy warmth had gone entirely out of his voice, replaced by something thin and strained that no amount of physicianly composure could fully disguise. "I believe, on the contrary, that you know exactly what I mean, Doctor, and I believe you have known it since the very moment I first laid these 3 items upon this table." Holmes's voice remained perfectly level throughout, neither raised nor accusatory in tone, which I have always found, in my long experience of watching him work, to be very much more unsettling to a guilty conscience than any amount of shouting could ever hope to achieve. "I believe you left this house by the side gate near 10 o'clock on the evening Sir Edmund Carlyle died, having some hours earlier that same evening administered, under the entirely trusted guise of his usual gout tincture, a rare alkaloid poison whose properties you alone, of every person within 100 miles of this house, are professionally equipped both to know and to employ with such precise and calculated effect. I believe you returned to this house later that same night, let yourself in without difficulty, as a trusted friend of 15 years' standing always may, built up the study fire with your own hands, in some attempt to hasten the poison's natural dissipation from the enclosed air of that small room before any post-mortem examination could be conducted. Were interrupted in this task before you could finish it by some sound or movement in the house that you had not anticipated, and fled the scene in considerable haste, leaving behind you, in that very haste, a false trail deliberately calculated to point any subsequent investigation towards some invented blackmailer or secret assignation, in the unhappy event that suspicion should ever come, in the end, to rest where it in fact belonged all along. For a long moment nobody at the table moved or spoke at all, the only sound the faint hiss of the candles, and, somewhere beyond the curtained windows, the low moan of the wind rising off the fog-bound park. Julian half rose from his chair at the foot of the table, his face a study in astonishment. Miss Carlyle had gone white as the tablecloth before her, one hand pressed hard against her mouth. Only Mrs. Whitmore spoke at last, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, but perfectly steady for all its quietness. "Tell them the truth, Alaric," she said. "Tell them, or I shall tell it myself, here and now, and spare you nothing in the telling." Chapter 9. The Confrontation. Dr. Fenwick's carefully maintained composure broke all at once, like river ice giving way beneath a weight it can no longer bear, cracking suddenly along lines that had plainly been forming, unseen, for a very long time indeed. He set down his wine-glass with exaggerated and visibly trembling care, as though the smallest sudden movement might shatter him along with it upon the polished floor. "You do not understand," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion that might, in different circumstances, have moved me to genuine pity. "None of you sitting at this table tonight truly understand what that man was, beneath the good name and the country manners and the seat upon the bench at quarter sessions." "Then I invite you to enlighten us all, Doctor," said Holmes quietly, "for I confess freely that the picture wants one final piece before it is complete, and I would very much rather have it from your own lips than piece it together second-hand from parish records and old newspapers." It came out slowly then, and in broken pieces of its own, as such confessions generally do. 20 years before, in Leeds, Fenwick had been a young and still largely untried physician, newly qualified and full of ambition, and Agnes Whitmore's husband, a gentle, learned man named William Whitmore, had been his closest friend in the world and his patient mentor in the finer and more delicate points of pharmacology, teaching him more of the true art of medicine, Fenwick said, with sudden and unexpected feeling, than any lecture hall in London had ever managed to do. Sir Edmund Carlyle, then a rising young speculator with more ambition than scruple, had ruined William Whitmore utterly in a fraudulent investment scheme dressed up in all the respectable trappings of a sound commercial venture, taking the greater part of the apothecary's modest fortune and, with it, every last vestige of the man's hard-won reputation, in a town where reputation was very nearly the whole of a man's worth. Whitmore had taken his own life within the year. In despair, he had confided to no one but Fenwick himself, a death the family had always given out, for the simple sake of common decency and the future prospects of his young widow, as nothing more than a sudden and tragic fever. Agnes had never known the whole and terrible truth of her husband's ruin, Fenwick said, until Fenwick himself, half drunk with grief and a guilt he had carried silently for years at having failed utterly to save his dearest friend from despair, had told her of it at last, quite by accident, some years afterward, once both of them had come, by strange and entirely separate paths that neither could have predicted, into service within Sir Edmund Carlyle's own household, she as his trusted housekeeper, and Fenwick himself, some years later still, as his trusted family physician, neither one, at first, aware that the other had ever known William Whitmore at all. "I did not plan it, not truly, not at the beginning," Fenwick said, his voice breaking at last. "But every single week that I dosed that man for his wretched gout, every week that I heard him speak so carelessly and so casually of the fortunes he had broken along his way to comfort, as though such things were merely the ordinary cost of doing business in this world, I thought of William in his lonely grave, and of Agnes serving that man his supper each evening with her own 2 hands, curtsying to him at the door as though he were nothing more than a kindly old employer, and I found, in the end, that I simply could not, let the matter stand as it was any longer." "And Mrs. Whitmore's own part in this?" Holmes asked, quietly but without hesitation, his eyes moving once to where Agnes Whitmore sat, unmoving, at the table's far end. "Knew nothing whatsoever of the poison until the deed itself was already done and irrevocable," Fenwick said quickly, almost desperately. "I swear that before God and before every person at this table, she has only known the whole truth these past 2 days, since I confessed it to her myself, in a moment of weakness I shall regret to my dying day, and she has said nothing at all to protect herself in the matter, choosing instead to say nothing at all, full stop, in order to protect me." A long silence followed his words, broken only by the soft settling of a log in the dining-room grate and the distant, muffled sound of the wind working at the shutters. Mrs. Whitmore did not deny a single word of it, nor did she weep, though her voice, when it came at last, carried a weight of 20 years' grief within it. "I should have gone directly to the police the very moment he told me the truth of it," she said. "I did not do so, Mr. Holmes, because for 20 long years I have secretly wished that someone, anyone, would do precisely what he in the end did do, and I discovered, when that long-held and shameful wish was at last granted to me, that I had not, after everything, the courage within me to be the one who sent him to the gallows for having granted it." Inspector Lestrade, summoned by an urgent note Holmes had dispatched by messenger before the dinner ever began, and waiting, at Holmes's own quiet suggestion, in the hall throughout the whole of the meal, stepped into the doorway at last, 2 uniformed constables silent at his back. "Dr. Alaric Fenwick," he said, his voice heavy with the particular gravity such moments always seemed to bring out in him, whatever his private feelings on the matter, "I am arresting you upon the charge of the wilful murder of Sir Edmund Carlyle, and I must caution you that anything you now say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." Fenwick rose without resistance, and it was Mrs. Whitmore, of all those present, who moved first, to steady him by the arm as he swayed upon his feet, an act of tenderness that drew a startled glance from Lestrade himself, and told me, more plainly than any confession could have done, the full and tangled depth of what lay between them. Not the guilty complicity Holmes had at first half suspected, but something closer to 20 years of shared and silent grief finally brought, however painfully, into the light. Miss Carlyle wept openly at last, no longer troubling to master herself before company, and Julian, to his credit, said nothing at all, but crossed the room in silence and stood beside his cousin with a hand upon her shoulder until the constables had led Fenwick away into the fog-bound night, the sound of the closing door echoing through the old house, like the fall of a final curtain. Chapter 10, Holmes Explains. It was well past midnight before Holmes and I sat once more beside our own fire at Baker Street. The case closed at last, the fog outside thicker than ever it had been, pressing against the familiar window panes like an old and patient friend. A neat piece of work in its logical construction, Watson, though I confess freely it has afforded me rather less satisfaction than most of our cases together, Holmes said, filling his pipe with slow, deliberate care. There is very little true pleasure to be had, I find, in unmasking a murderer one cannot, in the final accounting, entirely bring himself to despise. How did you first come to suspect Fenwick, above all the others, when every outward appearance spoke so strongly in his favour? By careful elimination chiefly, Watson, and by one single fact that none of the other candidates could ever satisfy. Examine the matter however I might turn it. Whoever administered that particular poison required not merely opportunity, which very nearly half the household possessed in one degree or another that evening, but a very particular, very rare, and very current species of specialist knowledge, the ability to select, from among the whole world's store of toxic substances, precisely the one alkaloid that would defeat every ordinary test then known to English forensic medicine, and to know, moreover, the exact dose required to mimic natural failure rather than betray itself through obvious violence. Mrs. Whitmore's late husband might once, in his own time, have possessed such specialist knowledge as an apothecary, but Mrs. Whitmore herself, whatever the depth and legitimacy of her private grief and her private wishes, plainly does not possess it in her own right. And young Julian Carlyle can scarcely be trusted, on the evidence of his own conduct these 3 days, to dose a common headache correctly, let alone to select a rare Southeast Asian alkaloid with such lethal and undetectable precision. Only a physician of genuine, thorough, and...
Before we move forward with the story, a quick moment. If you're drawn to these mysterious and classic tales, consider pressing that subscribe button. It's like discovering a vital clue in the dark. Don't forget to enable the notification bell so you never miss a development. Now, let's return to our case and see where the trail leads.
Entirely current pharmacological learning could ever have accomplished such a thing, and only one such physician, moreover, who held legitimate, regular, and entirely unremarkable access to Sir Edmund's own private medicine cabinet, which narrowed the whole field of suspicion, upon careful reflection, to precisely one man in the entire county. And the false trail you spoke of, the ticket, the crossword note, the whole business of Marsden Lane, those very nearly misled me for a time, Watson, exactly as they were designed and intended to do. But false trails, in my rather extensive experience of such matters, almost invariably betray themselves in the end by being altogether too complete, too neatly legible, too eager, and too obliging to be discovered by precisely the sort of investigator they were constructed to deceive, a criminal of truly patient genius trusts, in the final analysis, to the simple absence of evidence, Watson, and not to any manufactured abundance of it, however cleverly arranged. The very moment I discovered that single grey hair caught fast in the ticket's perforated edge, I understood with sudden clarity that we were looking not upon the murderer's careful and considered plan at all, but upon his private panic in its aftermath, the visible and unmistakable mark, if you will permit the expression, of a conscience already hard at its terrible work upon him, weeks before I myself ever set foot within that locked and silent study. He was silent a long moment, watching the fire settle and shift in the grate, his pipe forgotten for the moment in his hand. There is a lesson in the whole sorry business, I think, Watson, though I shall not trouble to moralize upon it at any great length tonight. Sir Edmund Carlyle ruined a good and gentle man some 20 years ago, and answered for that ruin in no court of this land, then or since. And a better man than himself, driven at last beyond his own considerable and long-tested endurance, paid that ancient debt in full at last, in the only coin the law of England permits to any private citizen, however aggrieved, and in doing so ruined a second good man beside himself, and very possibly a good woman too, who must now live out whatever years remain to her with the full and terrible knowledge of what her own long-held and secret wish ultimately cost. There is no tidy or comfortable justice to be found anywhere in that particular accounting, Watson, however tidily the surface puzzle itself has now resolved before us. But it is, I fear, very often and very stubbornly the way of these things, when one troubles to look beneath the surface at all. The crime we are called upon to solve, in the end, is very rarely the first crime in the chain, Watson. It is, almost without exception, only ever the last. I said nothing in reply, for there seemed, in that moment, nothing adequate that I could usefully say, and I have found, in all my years at Holmes's side, that silence is very often the only honest tribute one can pay to a grief that admits of no true remedy. After a good while longer, the fire burned low at last in the grate, the fog pressed on unchanged against our windows, and Holmes, at long last, allowed himself the rest that so terrible and so melancholy a case had, I think, very fully earned him.